Hi, this is Paul. I've been doing a lot in Jason Baxter's book, The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis. And in the first chapter, he has this great quote from Lewis about the medieval cosmos. Characteristically, medieval man was an organizer, a codifier, a man of system. His idea could not be unfairly summed up, a place for everything and everything in its right place. Three things are typical of him. First, that small minority of his cathedrals in which the design of the architect was actually achieved. I'm thinking of a thing like Salisbury, which is really fun because I managed to visit Salisbury Cathedral when I was in the UK last summer. Secondly, the Summa of Thomas Aquinas. And thirdly, the Divine Comedy of Dante. All these things alike, we see the tranquil, I always have a hard time saying that word, indefatigable, exultant energy of a passionate, logical mind ordering a huge mass of heterogeneous details into unity. They desire unity and proportion, all the classical virtues, just as keenly as the Greeks did, but they have a greater and more varied collection of things to fit in. And he talks, and as I've read before, Jason Baxter leans very heavily on transpositions. Now, Audible has a collection of C.S. Lewis essays, which is really excellent. It's a good value. Ralph Cossom reads them, and he reads them well. 38 hours. Now, there's no table of contents for this, and I remember I had to dig one up somewhere on the internet. And so I checked this, so there's 135 things in this massive collection. And it's a great collection of all different essays, and one of the essays is Transposition. Now, you don't actually have to get that book. It's not in some of the books that are common collections of C.S. Lewis's essays, but it is on the C.S. Lewis Essays YouTube channel, and the sermon is on it. And I decided this morning as I was listening to the sermon that it would be good to just go through the sermon and walk through it, kind of how I often do Jordan Peterson biblical series commentaries, and just walk through the sermon, talk about the sermon, because somebody mentioned in one of the previous videos where I was talking about this how excited I was about it. And that's true, I am excited about it. I'm excited about it because it's pretty exciting. I have to adjust my picture here. I think what I found so exciting about this is it gave me a much clearer idea. When we talk about spirit being primary and matter being secondary, Lewis, who in his book Miracles, I found that to be very vivid and helpful in terms of thinking about the resurrection and the new creation. But this sermon is very helpful in terms of me thinking about and imagining the relationship between what we call spirit and the spirit world and our world. And Lewis has this idea that he wants to put out, and I find it a very intriguing idea. So let's listen. The sermon's about 35 minutes long, so this video will probably be over an hour. And then there was nothing.
33. Transposition. This sermon was first preached in Mansfield College, Oxford, and later appeared in They Ask for a Paper, 1962. An expanded version appears in Screwtape Proposes a Toast and Other Pieces, 1998. In the church to which I belong, this day is set apart for commemorating the descent of the Holy Ghost upon the first Christians shortly after the Ascension. I want to consider one of the phenomena which accompanied or followed this descent. The phenomenon which our translation calls speaking with tongues, and which the learned call glossolalia. You will not suppose that I think this the most important aspect of Pentecost, but I have two reasons for selecting it. In the first place, it would be ridiculous for me to speak about the nature of the Holy Ghost or the modes of his operation. That would be an attempt to teach when I have nearly all to learn. In the second place, glossolalia has often been a stumbling block to me. It is, to be frank, an embarrassing phenomenon.
I found that interesting. Now, of course, he's doing this in the middle of the 20th century. The Azusa Street Revival has happened. Pentecostalism is spreading like fire all over the world. You have this Pentecostal belief that, well, the ability to speak in tongues is sort of this proof of the presence of the Holy Spirit. But for many people, this out of controlness is very un-Protestant, and you have this. It's very improper. And now, of course, Pentecostalism is going to break some things open in the world, but still today, in many churches, people are uncomfortable with things that don't seem quite in order or regular.
St. Paul himself seems to have been rather embarrassed by it in 1 Corinthians, and labours to turn the desire and the attention of the church to more obviously edifying gifts. But he goes no further. He throws in almost parenthetically the statement that he himself spoke with tongues more than anyone else, and he does not question the spiritual or supernatural source of the phenomenon.
Okay, so this word spiritual is going to obviously be the word that in many ways we are trying to figure out what we mean when we say it. We use this word all the time. What do you mean? I hear people use it, and most of the time I'm polite and I just let it go by. But if I'm in a Sunday school class or can somehow do it, I will pause them and say, exactly what do you mean by spiritual? And of course, we've got René Descartes back there with sort of a spirit is this other substance besides matter, which it's in a strange way sort of turns it into another material.
The difficulty I feel is this. On the one hand, glossolalia has remained an intermittent variety of religious experience down to the present day. Every now and then we hear that in some revivalist meeting one or more of those present has burst into a torrent of what appears to be gibberish. The thing does not seem to be edifying, and all non-Christian opinion would regard it as a kind of hysteria, an involuntary discharge of nervous excitement.
Okay, now what he did right there, it's easy to sort of listen to him talk about speaking in tongues, otherwise known as glossolalia, and some people will hear it, and you can see it mocked and so on and so forth. It's hysterical. There are many other types of sort of ecstatic speech or automatic speech. And then what we tend to do is sort of try to categorize that in our minds about, okay, well, and then we sort of pull out the supernatural card and say, well, you have all these ecstatic speeches, but that's all sort of a function of psychology. But then Christian one is sort of supernatural. And then a lot of people in a pluralistic age will call foul because, well, that's just Christian privilege. All the other miracles are bunk, but, Christian miracles are true. And so this is sort of the way all of these things go. But now Lewis is going to make a much more subtle argument. And one of the things that I thought of while I was listening to this morning was exaptation. Now, it's very common when we're talking in the cognitive science phrase to hear about exaptation. For example, an example of exaptation would be the fact that we have all of this brain power devoted to processing eyesight, but when we close our eyes, we can sort of imagine in pictures. That's an example of exaptation where we have structures that are put to dual use. Another example would be the tongue. The tongue, well, we use it for manipulating food and chewing, but I am also using it for speaking. And I'm speaking words that have a capacity that go far beyond what the tongue can do. The book of James talks about this. Who can control the tongue? And that's on one side. The other side, that the pen is mightier than the sword. Well, so is the tongue. Because the tongue will move armies, even though it can't move armies with your tongue. Are you going to push people around with your tongue? No. But it is speech. And so suddenly we have this hierarchy where, well, the tongue is good for chewing food and moving food around the mouth and, making sure the teeth can do their work. But the tongue can also be used to speak. And that speech now via the internet, that changes the world. And so that's, in a sense, a higher power, but it's still the tongue. And so on one hand, that's exaptation. Now, Lewis isn't going to use that word. I don't know if that word was even coined by the time that Lewis made this sermon, but exaptation and what Lewis calls transposition are not that far from each other.
A good deal even of Christian opinion would explain most instances of it in exactly the same way. And I must confess, non-Christian opinion would regard it as a kind of hysteria, an involuntary discharge of nervous excitement. A good deal even of Christian opinion would explain most instances of it in exactly the same way. And I must confess that it would be very hard to believe that in all instances of it the Holy Ghost is operating. We suspect, even if we cannot be sure, that it is usually an affair of the nerves.
And that's sort of Lewis's mid-20th century, an affair of the nerves. It's sort of a nice way of saying you've got these excitable people, and yeah, but at Oxford and Cambridge, we don't do this.
That is one horn of the dilemma. On the other hand, we cannot, as Christians, shelve the story of Pentecost, or deny that there, at any rate, the speaking with tongues was miraculous. For the men spoke not gibberish, but languages unknown to them, though known to other people present. And the whole event of which this makes part is built into the very fabric of the birth story of the Church.
Now, of course, a lot of theologians will sort of separate glossolalia when Paul's talking about it with respect to in 1 Corinthians 12, and the gift of tongues that happens on Pentecost. We'll just put all that to the side.
It is this very event which the risen Lord has told the Church to wait for, almost in the last words he uttered before his ascension. It looks, therefore, as if we shall have to say that the very same phenomenon, which is sometimes not only natural, but even pathological, is at other times, or at least at one other time, the organ of the Holy Ghost.
Right there. Okay, sometimes it's pathological, sometimes it's just strange, but at least on one time, it's the organ of the Holy Ghost. It's sort of exaptation, just like the tongue can be used for multiple things, just like the brain, the parts of the brain devoted to processing visual materials can be used for multiple things. So can this phenomena be used for multiple things. And of course, that's not a stretch for us to understand.
And this seems at first very surprising and very open to attack. The skeptic will certainly seize this opportunity to talk to us about Occam's razor, to accuse us of multiplying hypotheses. If most instances of glossolalia are covered by hysteria, is it not, he will ask, extremely probable that the explanation covers the remaining instances too? It is to this difficulty that I would gladly bring a little ease, if I can, and I will begin by pointing out that it belongs to a class of difficulties. The closest parallel to it within that class is raised by the erotic language and imagery we find in the mystics. In them we find a whole range of expressions, and therefore possibly of emotions, with which we are quite familiar in another context, and which, in that other context, have a clear natural significance.
Now, one of the conversations that Puppy Prison interrupted is my conversation with Josh Butler. Lewis's point here, well, the mystics, and how the mystics sometimes use very seemingly sexual language to describe intimacy with God. Lewis is basically saying, well, yeah, and of course Lewis has read all of this material and he's not shocked by it. He says, well, that's pretty standard stuff. And so Lewis is going to call it transposition. We might say it's sort of a metaphorical exaptation.
But in the mystical writings it is claimed that these elements have a different cause. And once more, the skeptic will ask why the cause which we are content to accept for 99 instances of such language should not be held to cover the 100th too.
And, I did the video on mysticism. I released that today. And with respect to this question about romance or sex or intimacy, everybody knows that certain modes of contemporary worship in America, Australia, in the English language world and beyond it are sort of criticized as, well, we're singing love songs to Jesus. Oh. We shouldn't do that. Oh. But that's really not of a different class than these mystical writings that are using sexual metaphors and romantic metaphors and in terms of our relationship with God.
hypothesis that mysticism is an erotic phenomenon will seem to him immensely more probable than any other. Put in its most general terms, our problem is that of the obvious continuity between things which are admittedly natural and things which, it is claimed, are spiritual.
And in other words, people singing love songs to Jesus, that's not erotic. It's not sexual. It's clearly of a different class. And he was saying the skeptics would make the argument that this is somehow a sexual function, but anybody who goes to, let's say, a big praise and worship church and watches, praise and worship go on would say, that's not sexual. It's intimate, and they're using romantic metaphors, and they're doing all this. And again, whether you agree with it or disagree with it, the point is, people singing love songs to Jesus is not sort of the evolution of human sexuality. It's a different thing. Now, there's a connection there, but it's not just, you can't just dismiss love songs to Jesus because all of the people in church are horny. No, that makes no sense. Or that all of the men singing love songs to Jesus are somehow same-sex attracted. No, none of that makes any sense. And this is part of the argument that Lewis is slowly building.
The reappearance in what professes to be our supernatural life of all the same old elements which make up our natural life, and, it would seem, of no others. If we have really been visited by a revelation from beyond nature, is it not very strange that an apocalypse can furnish heaven with nothing more than selections from terrestrial experience? Crowns, thrones, and music.
Let me play that again. Again, this goes by fast, and he's really very quickly putting together a very powerful argument.
If we have really been visited by a revelation from beyond nature, is it not very strange that an apocalypse can furnish heaven with nothing more than selections from terrestrial experience?
Now, one of the videos that I want to make at some point is more about extraterrestrials. I've been reading the Mothman prophecies. I've watched Skinwalker Ranch. I've got thoughts. And my thoughts are actually similar to this, because the truth is, we can only really comprehend what we sort of have the mental furniture and categories to comprehend with. And that's actually a big deal in a lot of these mystery hunts, in that people see giant birds or people see this or that. They're obviously having to use the categories available to them to communicate something that they've seen, heard, felt, etc. And Lewis is making that point, and he made that point in his book Miracles, that when you read the New Testament, well, sometimes it's all coming from the furniture of the people of the world that they live in, because, of course, those are the only categories that they have. Now, sometimes you'll notice they're trying to put things together to try to describe something, but again, that's what they have, and they're trying to describe something that is not sort of in the bestiary of planet Earth.
Crowns, thrones, and music, that devotion can find no language but that of human lovers, and that the rite whereby Christians enact a mystical union should turn out to be only the old familiar act of eating and drinking. And you may add that the very same problem also breaks out on a lower level, not only between spiritual and natural, but also between higher and lower levels of the natural life. Hence, cynics very plausibly...
In other words, so we take communion because we're hungry. Of course, Paul deals with that in 1 Corinthians 11. No, we're sort of exacting something for a higher level. And now he's going to make the point that actually you might point at this and say, well, these Christians sort of level jump, and they're complaining about that. And Lewis is going to say, oh no, we actually do that here within natural categories below that all of us will simply see and agree to.
Hikes out on a lower level, not only between spiritual and natural, but also between higher and lower levels of the natural life. Hence, cynics very plausibly challenge our civilized conception of the difference between love and lust by pointing out that when all is said and done, they usually end in what is, physically, the same act.
Okay, so there's love and there's lust. And we can all see the qualitative difference. Let's say a young woman might complain, a very beautiful young woman might complain that everyone is interested in her only because of lust. And what she's really looking for is love. And you might say, well, lust and love are the same thing. Or are they really? She knows the difference. Her parents know the difference. And at some point, some young man is going to know the difference. And he, in fact, will probably be able to marry this woman, while all of the other lustful suitors will be pushed aside because she says, I am more than just the quality of my physical attractiveness. And we all recognize this. But Lewis makes the point that part of what's happened in the materialist world is that everyone says that, well, love is just a level up from lust. Really? And they might say, yeah, and you can prove it because both lust and love end in the sex act. Oh, but, and this is where the beautiful young woman would say, hey, but wait a minute. I can tell a difference. Something different is happening here. There is a level of difference here that is significant. In fact, it's so significant, it is going to change my behavior and hopefully change my life and the life of a young suitor.
They similarly challenge the difference between justice and revenge on the ground that what finally happens to the criminal may be the same. And in all these cases, let us admit that the cynics and skeptics have a good prima facie case. The same acts do reappear in justice as well as in revenge. The consummation of humanized and conjugal love is physiologically the same as that of the merely biological lust. Religious language and imagery, and probably religious emotion too, contains nothing that has not been borrowed from nature. Now it seems to me that the only way to refute the critic here is to show that the same prima facie case is equally plausible in some instances where we all know, not by faith or by logic, but empirically, that it is in fact false. Can we find an instance of higher and lower where the higher is within almost everyone's experience? I think we can. Consider the following quotation from Pepys's diary.
I didn't know how to say it, and some of you in the comments section say it's pronounced Peeps. It's pronounced Peeps. Well, there it is. This is an example from Pepys's diary.
With my wife to the king's house to see the Virgin Martyr, and it is mighty pleasant. But that which did please me beyond anything in the whole world was the wind music when the angel comes down, which is so sweet that it ravished me, and, indeed, in a word, did wrap up my soul so that it made me really sick, just as I have formerly been when in love with my wife, and makes me resolve to practice wind music, and to make my wife do the like. 27th of February, 1688. There are several points here that deserve attention. Firstly, that the internal sensation accompanying intense aesthetic delight was indistinguishable from the sensation accompanying two other experiences, that of being in love, and that of being, say, in a rough channel crossing. 2. That of these two other experiences, one at least is the very reverse of pleasurable. No man enjoys nausea. 3. That Pepys was, nevertheless, anxious to have again the experience whose sensational accompaniment was identical with the very unpleasant accompaniments of sickness. That was why he decided to take up wind music. Now it may be true that not many of us have fully shared Pepys's experience, but we have all experienced that sort of thing. For myself, I find that if, during a moment of intense aesthetic rapture, one tries to turn round and catch by introspection what one is actually feeling, one can never lay one's hand on anything but a physical sensation. In my case, it is a kind of kick or flutter in the diaphragm.
Okay. So he's making an argument, which again, exaptation is sort of similar to transposition. And with Pepys, the certain physiological experience is connected with different positive and negative situations and perhaps even to one degree or another stimuli, which is interesting. And Lewis says basically a similar thing. Maybe not exactly like Peep's, but in another way, he notices that it seems to be the same nerves, the same physiological experience, but with very different causes. And one, just like similarly to the difference between lust and love, is quite a bit higher. Lust says, I want you right now and I don't care about you after the fact. Love says, I want you now and forever, and even when maybe you don't look like you look now. There's something in you, there's a you besides your beauty, your physical beauty, that I desire and wish to commune with.
Perhaps that is all Pepys meant by really sick. But the important point is this. I find that this kick or flutter is exactly the same sensation which, in me, accompanies great and sudden anguish. Introspection can discover no difference at all between my neural response to very bad news and my neural response to the overture of the magic flute. If I were to judge simply by sensations, I should come to the absurd conclusion that joy and anguish are the same thing, that what I most dread is the same with what I most desire. Introspection discovers nothing more or different in the one than in the other. And I expect that most of you, if you are in the habit of noticing such things, will report more or less the same. Now let us take a step farther. These sensations, Pepys's sickness and my flutter in the diaphragm, do not merely accompany very different experiences as an irrelevant or neutral addition. We may be quite sure that Pepys hated that sensation when it came in real sickness. And we know from his own words that he liked it when it came with wind music, for he took measures to make as sure as possible of getting it again. And I likewise love this internal flutter in one context, and call it a pleasure, and hate it in another, and call it misery. It is not a mere sign of joy and anguish, it becomes what it signifies. When the joy thus flows over into the nerves, that overflow is its consummation. When the anguish thus flows over, that physical symptom is the crowning horror. The very same thing which makes the sweetest drop of all in the sweet cup also makes the bitterest drop in the bitter. And here, I suggest, we have found what we are looking for. I take our emotional life to be higher than the life of our sensations. Not, of course, morally higher, but richer, more varied, more subtle.
And his point right there is important. We take our emotional life, and we do this commonly, we do this publicly, we take this to be higher than our mere sensations. Emotions matter. And again, Lewis, who is, a master of logic and reason, is just saying we care about emotions and we value emotions and we do so publicly. Emotions are, if you're going to the doctor is going to say, hold on, this is going to hurt. Well, why is he saying that? Either way, it's going to hurt. But if the doctor does it without warning you or telling you, or the doctor seems to be uncaring about it, well, it's exactly the same physical pain, but now emotions are different. And he's saying, well, this transposition happens between just simple pain and emotions.
And this is a higher level which nearly all of us know. And I believe that if anyone watches carefully the relation between his emotions and his sensations, he will discover the following facts. 1. That the nerves do respond, and in a sense most adequately and exquisitely, to the emotions. 2. That their resources are far more limited, the possible variations of sense far fewer than those of emotion. 3. And that the senses compensate for this by using the same sensation to express more than one emotion.
The senses use this to, in other words, the senses are lower than the emotion. The emotion is a larger world, and the senses have a very limited bandwidth with which to manage the far larger world of emotions. And you can see this with, let's say someone is grieving and they are depressed. Well, if they're grieving and they're depressed versus they're depressed for some, let's say, purely physiological reason or something of that nature, we know that the world that has caused the depression is far larger than just, let's say, the physiological cause for a particular thing.
even, as we have seen, to express opposite emotions. Where we tend to go wrong is in assuming that if there is to be a correspondence between two systems, it must be a one-for-one correspondence, that A in the one system must be represented by A in the other, and so on. But the correspondence between emotion and sensation turns out not to be of that sort. And there never could be correspondence of that sort where the one system was really richer than the other. If the richer system is to be represented in the poorer at all, this can only be by giving each element in the poorer system more than one meaning. The transposition of the richer into the poorer must, so to speak, be algebraical, not arithmetical.
Okay, so you can think about this, let's say, with imagination and the exaptation of the mind and eyesight. The mind is a far larger, richer system, the imagination, than just eyesight. Now, we've demonstrated this with computer graphics and all of that. We have sort of taken all of this and projected it so we can both, it's imagined in the mind of the artist, and then it's produced out in the world so that the eye can see. And we like that. We very much like that process. But again, Luce's argument is the emotions are far larger than the available palette that the sensations have to manage the emotional world. The imaginative world is a far larger world than the palette that the eyes have available to them to see. And in a sense, we almost have that with dreams. There's a nice little section on dreams with Peterson and Chris Lunsdorf. There's Oliver Anthony.
If you are to translate from a language which has a large vocabulary into a language that has a small vocabulary, then you must be allowed to use several words in more than one sense. If you are to write a language with 22 vowel sounds in an alphabet with only 5 vowel characters, then you must be allowed to give each of those 5 characters more than one value.
And you see this with people with limited vocabularies and other limitations. It isn't that they're unable to do some things. They have to sort of work harder around it because they have limited resources with which to try to map the much larger world.
If you are making a piano version of a piece originally scored for an orchestra, then the same piano notes which represent flutes in one passage must also represent violins in another. As the examples show, we are all quite familiar with this kind of transposition or adaptation from a richer to a poorer medium. The most familiar example of all is the art of drawing. The problem here is to represent a three-dimensional world on a flat sheet of paper. The solution is perspective, and perspective means that we must give more than one value to a two-dimensional shape. Thus, in a drawing of a cube, we use an acute angle to represent what is a right angle in the real world. But elsewhere, an acute angle on the paper may represent what was already an acute angle in the real world. For example, the point of a spear or the gable of a house.
He's basically talking about the difference between the map and the territory. We reduce the territory down to a map. We reduce an object, a cube, down to a line drawing.
Same shape which you must draw to give the illusion of a straight road receding from the spectator is also the shape you draw for a dunce's cap. As with the lines, so with the shading. Your brightest light in the picture is, in literal fact, only plain white paper, and this must do for the sun, or a lake in evening light, or snow, or human flesh. I now make 2 comments on the instances of transposition which are already before us. 1. It is clear that in each case what is happening in the lower medium can be understood only if we know the higher medium. The instance where this knowledge is most commonly lacking is the musical one. The piano version means one thing to the musician who knows the original orchestral score, and another thing to the man who hears it simply as a piano piece.
In other words, there's there's the entire thing, and then there's a reduction to the piano. Someone who has only heard the piano tune only knows it. The person who knows the full orchestra version of it, when they hear the piano, a part of them sort of sees through the transposition of the piano and hears the full orchestra. It's a richer world.
But the second man would be at an even greater disadvantage if he had never heard any instrument but a piano, and even doubted the existence of other instruments.
In other words, one would come and say, let me tell you, we're hearing the same music, but with violins and trumpets and kettle drums and flutes and French horns. This is an amazing piece, and I can very much enjoy it on the piano, but when I hear it from the orchestra, even through the piano music, and the other person says, there's no such thing as flutes. I've never seen a flute. How could there be a flute? How could someone, would they blow and move their fingers on something? Inconceivable.
Even more, we understand pictures only because we know and inhabit the three-dimensional world. If we can imagine a creature who perceived only 2 dimensions, and yet could somehow be aware of the lines as he crawled over them on the paper, we shall easily see how impossible it would be for him to understand. At first, he might be prepared to accept on authority our assurance that there was a world in 3 dimensions. But when we pointed to the lines on the paper and tried to explain, say, that this is a road, would he not reply that the shape which we were asking him to accept as a revelation of our mysterious other world was the very same shape which, on our own showing, elsewhere meant nothing but a triangle? And soon, I think, he would say, you keep on telling me of this other world and its unimaginable shapes, which you call solid. But isn't it very suspicious that all the shapes which you offer me as images or reflections of the solid ones turn out, on inspection, to be simply the old 2-dimensional shapes of my own world as I have always known it? Is it not obvious that your vaunted other world, so far from being the archetype, is a dream which borrows all its elements from this one? 2.
In other words, let's say you only saw, all you've known is a picture of the Grand Canyon. And you say, yeah, this is a beautiful picture, but let me tell you, the Grand Canyon is far beyond this picture. And they might say, I don't believe a Grand Canyon exists. Maybe what they've done somewhere is to take this and just blow it up and make it bigger. Say, oh, no, you cannot really fit the Grand Canyon in this picture. You cannot really do justice to Yosemite in this photograph, no matter how many pictures of Yosemite I have taken in the years that I've lived in Northern California.
It is of some importance to notice that the word symbolism is not adequate in all cases to cover the relation between the higher medium and its transposition in the lower.
Now, because symbolism is so important in this little corner, before he shows its limitation, it's helpful to understand its power. Because when we talk about symbolism, and when you listen to Jonathan Peugeot draw these connections, this is exactly what he's doing. And saying that the far greater realities of the universe that are both spiritual, that get fleshed into material, there's a correspondence between them. But as Lewis said before, the correspondence need not be one-to-one.
It covers some cases perfectly, but not others. Is not adequate in all cases to cover some, borrows all its elements from this one. 2. It is of some importance to notice that the word symbolism is not adequate in all cases to cover the relation between the higher medium and its transposition in the lower. It covers some cases perfectly, but not others. Thus the relation between speech and writing is one of symbolism. The written characters exist solely for the eye, the spoken words solely for the ear. There is complete discontinuity between them. They are not like one another, nor does the one cause the other to be. The one is simply a sign of the other and signifies it by a convention. But a picture is not related to the visible world in just that way. Pictures are part of the visible world themselves and represent it only by being part of it. Their visibility has the same source. The suns and lamps in pictures seem to shine only because real suns or lamps shine on them. That is, they seem to shine a great deal because they really shine a little in reflecting their archetypes. The sunlight in a picture is therefore not related to real sunlight, simply as written words are to spoken. It is a sign, but also something more than a sign, and only a sign because it is also more than a sign, because in it the thing signified is really in a certain mode present. If I had to name the relation, I should call it not symbolical, but sacramental. But in the case we started from, that of emotion and sensation, we are even further beyond mere symbolism. For there, as we have seen, the very same sensation does not merely accompany nor merely signify diverse and opposite emotions, but becomes part of them. The emotion descends bodily, as it were, into the sensation, and digests, transforms, transubstantiates it, so that the same thrill along the nerves is delight, or is agony. I am not going to maintain that what I call transposition is the only possible mode whereby a poorer medium can respond to a richer. But I claim that it is very hard to imagine any other. It is, therefore, at the very least not improbable that transposition occurs whenever the higher reproduces itself in the lower. Thus,
there was a lot in there, and it's worthwhile going back and listening to it a few times. He's basically making the argument that the fact that we note transpositions, the fact that we note that there is richer and poorer, suggests that it is not the case that lustful men sort of move into love simply to satisfy their lusts, but rather it's going the other way. And again, when you think of a medieval cosmology, it goes the other way. The earth is not the center of the universe. The earth is the bottom of the universe. And the only thing lower being hell. So again, you think about up and you think about down. And so what you see here, much like Jason Baxter is arguing, you see what Lewis is doing is Lewis is putting back together a medieval cosmology in modern terms using modern arguments and modern realities. He's putting them back in terms of the directionality and making the argument that the best way to account for the richness we experience is not just emergence from the bottom up, but much more emanation from the top down.
To digress for a moment, it seems to me very likely that the real relation between mind and body is one of transposition. We are certain that, in this life at any rate, thought is intimately connected with the brain. The theory that thought, therefore, is merely a movement in the brain is, in my opinion, nonsense. For if so, that theory itself would be merely a movement, an event among atoms, which may have speed and direction, but of which it would be meaningless to use the words true or false.
Now you can do this with math, because you might say, math is simply a movement of the brain. But then why does it work? Why are engineers required to use math to demonstrate to civic authorities that a bridge is sound for all the legal and humanitarian reasons that there are? In other words, and this is actually, again, Lewis's argument against Darwinism, because if, in fact, thought is just movements of the brain, then we would have no real basis upon which to imagine that these movements of the brain actually correspond with anything out there.
Driven then to some kind of correspondence. But if we assume a one-for-one correspondence, this means that we have to attribute an almost unbelievable complexity and variety of events to the brain. But I submit that a one-for-one relation is probably quite unnecessary.
And again, if you look at exaptation, it's not a one-for-one. The same mental machinery does visual imagination as processes visual input. And, well, why? Well, because that's more efficient. Now, it's amazing that we can do this, but it's difficult to imagine exactly. He's making the argument that it stands to reason that there's a richer and a poorer. And we're at the poorer end of this. We're at the bottom end of this, that there must be a far richer, and we know that because we can see it and we can participate in it. But even our experience with it, of growing up into it, suggests that there is further more to go, whether that is sort of as the amount of human knowledge expands, even the concept of it being knowledge and not just sort of imagination, that it in fact relates to something, that it is in fact true, suggests that there is a much bigger world out there that we are only sort of continuing to awaken to.
All our examples suggest that the brain can respond, in a sense adequately and exquisitely correspond, to the seemingly infinite variety of consciousness without providing one single physical modification for each single modification of consciousness. But that is a digression. Let us now return to our original question about spirit and nature, God and man. Our problem was that in what claims to be our spiritual life, all the elements of our natural life recur. And, what is worse, it looks at first glance as if no other elements were present. We now see that if the spiritual is richer than the natural, as no one who believes in its existence would deny, then this is exactly what we should expect. And the skeptic's conclusion that the so-called spiritual is really derived from the natural, that it is a mirage or projection or imaginary extension of the natural, is also exactly what we should expect. For, as we have seen, this is the mistake which an observer who knew only the lower medium would be bound to make in every case of transposition. The brutal man never can, by analysis, find anything but lust in love. The flatlander never can find anything but flat shapes in a picture. Physiology never can find anything in thought except twitchings of the grey matter. It is no good browbeating the critic who approaches a transposition from below. On the evidence available to him, his conclusion is the only one possible. Everything is different when you approach the transposition from above, as we all do in the case of emotion and sensation, or of the three-dimensional world and pictures, and as the spiritual man does in the case we are considering. Those who spoke with tongues, as St. Paul did, can well understand how that holy phenomenon differed from the historical phenomenon. Although, be it remembered, they were, in a sense, exactly the same phenomenon. Just as the very same sensation came to Peeps in love, in the enjoyment of music, and in sickness. Spiritual things are spiritually discerned. The spiritual man judges all things, and is judged of none. But who dares claim to be a spiritual man? In the full sense, none of us. And yet we are somehow aware that we approach from above, or from inside, at least some of those transpositions which embody the Christian life in this world. With whatever sense of unworthiness, with whatever sense of audacity, we must affirm that we know a little of the higher system which is being transposed. In a way, the claim we are making is not a very startling one. We are only claiming to know that our apparent devotion, whatever else it may have been, was not simply erotic, or that our apparent desire for heaven, whatever else it may have been, was not simply a desire for longevity, or jewelry, or social splendors. Perhaps we have never really attained at all to what St. Paul would describe as spiritual life. But at the very least we know, in some dim and confused way, that we were trying to use natural acts and images and language with a new value, have at least desired a repentance which was not merely prudential, and a love which was not self-centered.
Now, Lewis basically makes the same argument in his book Miracles when he sort of analyzes the ascension. And so on one hand, he says, on one hand, that is in fact the best way to describe things, the way a common person would. But the description does not exhaust the reality of it. There's a concreteness to simplicity, but simplicity is, of course, by definition, its own limitation.
At the worst, we know enough of the spiritual to know that we have fallen short of it, as if the picture knew enough of the three-dimensional world to be aware that it was flat.
And every time I take a picture of Yosemite, and I have countless photographs of Yosemite Valley and Half Dome and El Capitan, Every time I take a picture, I know it is a reduction. And I keep taking pictures in order to have it be less of a reduction, but I always bump into the fact that it is a reduction, that it is far larger and grander and far more real than the little digital captures that I have made of it.
It is not only for humility's sake, that, of course, that we must emphasize the dimness of our knowledge. I suspect that, save by God's direct miracle, spiritual experience can never abide introspection. If even our emotions will not do so, since the attempt to find out what we are now feeling yields nothing more than a physical sensation, much less will the operations of the Holy Ghost. The attempt to discover by introspective analysis our own spiritual condition is to me a horrible thing, which reveals, at best, not the secrets of God's Spirit and ours, but their transpositions in intellect, emotion, and imagination, and which at worst may be the quickest road to presumption or despair. I believe that this doctrine of transposition provides for most of us a background very much needed for the theological virtue of hope. We can hope only for what we can desire. And the trouble is that any adult and philosophically respectable notion we can form of heaven is forced to deny of that state most of the things our nature desires. There is, no doubt, a blessedly ingenuous faith, a child's or a savage's faith, which finds no difficulty.
Now, he's going to deal with some of the stuff that I dealt with, the mysticism question in, is the closer we get to the source of this, what happens to the more rudimentary transpositions that we deal with now?
It accepts without awkward questionings the harps and golden streets, and the family reunions pictured by hymn writers. Such a faith is deceived, yet in the deepest sense not deceived, for while it errs in mistaking symbol for fact, yet it apprehends heaven as joy and plenitude and love. But it is impossible for most of us, and we must not try by artifice to make ourselves more naive than we are.
Okay. Now this is this is subtle, but again, one of the things that you find if you read enough Lewis is that he's often making the same points in multiple places, which is pretty much normal for any writer or thinker or preacher or philosopher. On one hand, streets of gold, family reunions, these are our pictures of heaven. And Lewis, by virtue of his doctrine, as he calls it, doctrine of transposition, says these are reductions of what it is. Okay. Now that might begin to disturb some people because they say, but I want a family reunion. Yes. What you see as a family reunion will be far greater than the family reunion you please. I mean, it's not dissimilar to this great illustration he has of children and sex. You're talking to some child, somehow learns of this hidden world of adult sexuality and is a little bit mystified by it, and so asks a question, will there be chocolate? And the adult thinks for a moment and says, well, there could be chocolate. And that might satisfy the child, because for the child, the greatest thing the child can imagine is chocolate. But the world of adult sexuality in wholeness and goodness is far greater than mere chocolate. And so you can certainly have chocolate at the moment, but once you get there, describing it as chocolate will seem a bit of a reduction. But now let's be careful not to sort of be willfully dumb it down.
A man does not become as a little child by aping childhood. Hence our notion of heaven involves perpetual negations. No food, no drink, no sex, no movement, no mirth, no events, no time, no art. Against all these, to be sure, we set one positive, the vision and enjoyment of God.
So, the beatific vision, Dante's heaven, is, Lewis notes, is there's all this negation. And to set against it, it is all of the source. Okay. And this is, I think, part of the genius of Lewis's book, Miracles, because it is, in fact, similar to the chocolate sex analogy. The fullness, it is not that the fullness is the negation of the whole. And I made that with the shot glass and the tumbler. The whole is, of course, greater than the tumbler because it's the whole. It's the everything. But it, of course, can include tumblers and shot glasses because they are smaller, but they are not merely tumblers and shot glasses. And again, this is difficult to talk about, but we can just sort of imagine where this goes and why. And in a minute, you'll see how Lewis sort of comes around for this. And if, of course, if you've read The Last Battle, you can see what he does. And this is joy to us because with every shot glass, with every tumbler, with every family reunion, this is where Lewis gets into his longing. Even the best family reunions, there is within us a longing for a greater one, because the family reunion itself is the product of that which spiritually produces a family reunion. Now, a family reunion is an enormously complex thing because human beings are complex and they're all together, and you have all of this history and all of these relationships and all of these emotions. But its source is, of course, more, and we are limited. And so, but yet, even in our limitation, with any spiritual sensitivity at all, we will recognize that every family reunion here below, however good, doesn't quite fully satisfy. And this is sort of Lewis's argument from desire.
And since this is an infinite good, we hold, rightly, that it outweighs them all. That is, the reality of the beatific vision would, or would infinitely outweigh the reality of the negations. But can our present notion of it outweigh our present notion of them? That is quite a different question.
Okay, because when we're just using the words about the fullness and the infinite reality and all of that, we're having to compare that negation and its abstraction with the very concrete realities of a family reunion. And for us, the family reunion is far more vivid because it has a reality in a sense that our mental imagination of the fullness cannot have.
And for most of us, at most times, the answer is no. How it may be for great saints and mystics, I cannot tell. But for others, the conception of that vision is a difficult, precarious, and fugitive extrapolation from a very few and ambiguous moments in our earthly experience, while our idea of the negated natural goods is vivid and persistent, loaded with the memories of a lifetime, built into our nerves and muscles, and therefore into our imagination.
So in other words, he's saying that for maybe some mystics, he can't tell because he's not one of them. Maybe some mystics, they have these moments of rapture. You know, again, you could look at some of what the Apostle Paul writes about and being caught up to the third heaven. You can think about Charles Finney. You can think about Pascal. You can think about rapturous moments. But of course, was it Dwight Moody? I don't remember. Or Dwight Moody. You know, you have to beg God to stop because the shot glasses, you're going to break the shot glass. You are immense and I am tiny. C.S. Lewis gets at this in The Great Divorce, where some of the ghosts are trying to bring an apple back onto the bus, and the angel basically says, you've got this quite wrong. There's no room in your world for that, because that is a real thing. And there's no room in us for that, because that is more real than even the family reunion. And again, this is tricky because we have, for the most part, phenomenologically and in a material world philosophically assumed that, again, deeply, that spiritual is a projection. It is less real than the material. And his argument is that the material is the product of the spiritual, and therefore it is less real. That doesn't mean it is not real. And because of how we are, there is a reality to it that, in a sense, a real thing like a family reunion full of real people has more reality in it than the negation-laden projection of my mind about one that I imagine, even if I fill it up with a beatific vision, etc., etc., etc. I remember in seminary having a conversation with an African seminary student about, whether there will be basketball in heaven. And of course, no, we will just, he just basically took Dante's, we will just be there. Does that include basketball? It's sort of, again, like asking, well, will there be chocolate with sex? You can have chocolate with sex. Chocolate and sex go along very well together. But for the vast majority of us, the chocolate is just a whimsical addition to the sex.
Thus the negatives have, so to speak, an unfair advantage in every competition with the positive. And what is worse, their presence, and most when we most resolutely try to suppress or ignore them, vitiates even such a faint and ghost-like notion of the positive as we might have had. The exclusion of the lower goods begins to seem the essential characteristic of the higher good. We feel, if we do not say, that the vision of God will come not to fulfill, but to destroy our nature. This bleak fantasy often underlines our very use of such words as holy, or pure, or spiritual. We must not allow this to happen if we can possibly prevent it. We must believe, and therefore in some degree imagine, that every negative will be only the reverse side of a fulfilling. And we must mean by that the fulfilling precisely of our humanity, not our transformation into angels, nor our absorption into deity. For though we shall be as the angels, and made like unto our Master, I think this means like with the likeness proper to men, as different instruments that play the same air, but each in its own fashion. How far the life of the risen man will be sensory, we do not know. But I surmise that it will differ from the sensory life we know here. Not as emptiness differs from water, or water from wine, but as a flower differs from a bulb, or a cathedral from an architect's drawing. And it is...
In other words, to go back to what we are now is a seed. Now, I deal with this in my rough draft for Sunday for this week, for Sunday the 10th. And I use pictures of young Arnold Schwarzenegger and young Raquel Welch. These images will be salient to the demographic of my congregation. Maybe not too many of you. And Paul in Philippians 3 talks about how we will be given glorious bodies. And what we are now will be the seed to the reality of that new creation and that new body.
Here that transposition helps me. Let us construct a fable. Let us picture a woman thrown into a dungeon. There she bears and rears a son. He grows up seeing nothing but the dungeon walls, the straw on the floor, and a little patch of the sky seen through the grating, which is too high up to show anything except sky. This unfortunate woman was an artist, and when they imprisoned her, she managed to bring with her a drawing pad and a box of pencils. As she never loses the hope of deliverance, she is constantly teaching her son about that outer world which he has never seen. She does it very largely by drawing him pictures. With her pencil, she attempts to show him what fields, rivers, mountains, cities, and waves on a beach are like. He is a dutiful boy, and he does his best to believe her when she tells him that that outer world is far more interesting and glorious than anything in the dungeon. At times he succeeds. On the whole, he gets on tolerably well until, one day, he says something that gives his mother pause. For a minute or two they are at cross purposes. Finally, it dawns on her that he has, all these years, lived under a misconception. "But," she gasps, "you didn't think that the real world was full of lines drawn in lead pencil." "What?" says the boy. "No pencil marks there?" And instantly his whole notion of the outer world becomes a blank. For the lines by which alone he was imagining it have now been denied of it. He has no idea of that which will exclude and dispense with the lines, that of which the lines were merely a transposition. The waving treetops, the light dancing on the weir, the coloured three-dimensional realities which are not enclosed in lines, but define their own shapes at every moment with a delicacy and multiplicity which no drawing could ever achieve. The child will get the idea that the real world is somehow less visible than his mother's pictures. In reality, it lacks lines because it is incomparably more visible. So with us. We know not what we shall be, but we may be sure we shall be more, not less, than we were on earth. Our natural experiences, sensory, emotional, imaginative, are only like the drawing, like penciled lines on flat paper. If they vanish in the risen life, they will vanish only as pencil lines vanish from the real landscape, not as a candle flame that is put out, but as a candle flame which becomes invisible because someone has pulled up the blind, thrown open the shutters, and let in the blaze of the risen sun.
Now you can see the beauty of this, because if you can follow along with this, again, like the little boy who has only known the dungeon, a little bit of Plato's cave going on here, like the little boy who has only known the dungeon, all he can do is sort of imaginatively, understanding transposition, feel the excitement of the hope. Oh, it will be more than chocolate. It will be so much more than chocolate. Oh, surely, if you wish to have chocolate, even the chocolate will be more than chocolate.
You can put it whichever way you please. You can say that by transposition our humanity, senses and all can be made the vehicle of beatitude. Or you can say that the heavenly bounties by transposition are embodied during this life in our temporal experience. But the second way is the better. It is the present life which is the diminution, the symbol, the attenuated, the, as it were, vegetarian substitute. If flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom, that is not because they are too solid, too gross, too distinct, too illustrious with being. They are too flimsy, too transitory, too phantasmal. With this...
So in other words, his admonition is to not just go the way of the abstract negations, because even though that's absolutely valid and fair, but that having, in a sense, let's use another Vervaeke word, the imaginal, having the imaginal on top of the physical might get us closer to and actually motivate us to run this race, as the Apostle Paul says, to run this race to win. So that when we enjoy a family reunion, we can begin to understand that, oh, this is sorry, Hershey. This is just a Hershey bar compared to Ghirardelli's. This is the shadow of the great reality. And again, Lewis does this with his book, The Last Battle. And that for me, listening to this strengthens me and helps me, because I first sort of got an inkling of this with The Last Battle. And then I saw it more and more clearly with each reading of Miracles. And now, as I continue on with this, it excites me. It encourages me. It makes me more... I remember having a talk with a good friend of mine who passed away a number of years ago, and he was the music buyer for Tower Records. He bought music. He bought opera and classical music for Tower Records. Incredible, an incredible library that his poor widow was saddled with. Musical library. And he just had an incredible mind for music, and he loved music, and he loved opera, and he was a recovering alcoholic, and but that which He loved food, he loved trips, he loved friendships, and he was a joy to me in this church while we were here. He would call me during the day. You're supposed to be selling insurance. I don't want to sell insurance. I'd rather talk to you. And we'd talk about this and that. And then when he was dying, he part of him was, I don't want to leave this world because it's a world of music and it's a world of lunches with you and of friendship and of watching the Sacramento Kings the few times that they win, and of going to movies with my daughter, and of listening to music and enjoying music. And I would keep saying, I'd say, Neil, these are but the shadows of the music you enjoy. I had a hard time with that. And so I would give him Lewis, and I don't know that I ever fully succeeded, but in some ways the point isn't necessarily the poverty of my ability to communicate him or the poverty of his ability to grasp it, but the reality that when he arrived, he could see that I was right. And now he knows far better than I, who tried to convince him of it, of the fact that, because for him, life with Christ sounded dull. And I kept saying, in the resurrection, your body won't let you do hardly even walk anymore, my friend, but you'll be able to run again. You won't just be able to watch basketball, you'll be able to play. And Lewis, for me, has been so helpful in this. Again, sort of, the last battle is sort of, there's the children's version, and miracles is sort of, okay, here's another, let's open up our imagination a little bit. And here in Transpositions, it just, and when I see it and feel it, it gives me such hope. It gives me such hope.
My case, as the lawyers say, is complete. But I have just 4 points to add. 1. I hope it is quite clear that the conception of transposition, as I call it, is distinct from another conception often used for the same purpose. I mean the conception of development. The developmentalist explains the continuity between things that claim to be spiritual and things that are certainly natural by saying that the one slowly turned into the other. I believe this view explains some facts, but I think it has been much overworked. At any rate, it is not the theory I am putting forward. I am not saying that the natural act of eating after millions of years somehow blossoms into the Christian sacrament. I am saying that the spiritual reality which existed before there were any creatures who ate gives this natural act a new meaning, and more than a new meaning, makes it, in a certain context, to be a different thing.
In other words, it's exaptation via emanation.
In a word, I think that real landscapes enter into pictures, not that pictures will one day sprout into real trees and grass. 2. I have found it impossible, in thinking of what I call transposition, not to ask myself whether it may help us to conceive the incarnation. Of course, if transposition were merely a mode of symbolism, it could give us no help at all in this matter. On the contrary, it would lead us wholly astray, back into a new kind of Docetism, or would it be only the old kind, and away from the utterly historical and concrete reality which is the center of all our hope, faith, and love. But then, as I have pointed out, transposition is not always symbolism. In varying degrees, the lower reality can actually be drawn into the higher and become part of it. The sensation which accompanies joy becomes itself joy. We can hardly choose but say, incarnate joy. If this is so, then I venture to suggest, though with great doubt and in the most provisional way, that the concept of transposition may have some contribution to make to the theology, or at least to the philosophy, of the Incarnation. For we are told in one of the creeds that the Incarnation worked not by conversion of the Godhead into flesh, but by taking of the manhood into God. And it seems to me that there is a real analogy between this and what I have called transposition, that humanity, still remaining itself, is not merely counted as, but veritably drawn into, deity, seems to me like what happens when a sensation, not in itself a pleasure, is drawn into the joy it accompanies. But I walk in mirabilibus supra me, and submit all to the verdict of real theologians. 3. I have tried to stress throughout the inevitableness of the error made about every transposition by one who approaches it from the lower medium only. The strength of such a critic lies in the words merely or nothing but. He sees all the facts, but not the meaning. Quite truly, therefore, he claims to have seen all the facts.
And this, of course, is what we've been talking about from the beginning. Oh, yes, you see that the tongue can be used for speaking as well as chewing. But speaking is not just a further development of chewing.
There is nothing else there, except the meaning. He is, therefore, as regards the matter in hand, in the position of an animal. You will have noticed that most dogs cannot understand pointing. You point to a bit of food on the floor. The dog, instead of looking at the floor, sniffs at your finger. A finger is a finger to him, and that is all. His world is all fact and no meaning. And in a period when factual realism is dominant, we shall find people deliberately inducing upon themselves this dog-like mind. A man who has experienced love from within will deliberately go about to inspect it analytically from outside, and regard the results of this analysis as truer than his experience. The extreme limit of this self-blinding is seen in those who, like the rest of us, have consciousness, yet go about to study the human organism as if they did not know it was conscious. As long as this deliberate refusal to understand things from above, even where such understanding is possible, continues, it is idle to talk of any final victory over materialism. The critique of every experience from below, the voluntary ignoring of meaning and concentration on fact, will always have the same plausibility. There will always be evidence, and every month fresh evidence, to show that religion is only psychological, justice only self-protection, politics only economics, love only lust, and thought itself only cerebral biochemistry. 4. Finally, I suggest that what has been said of transposition throws a new light on the doctrine of the resurrection of the body. For in a sense, transposition can do anything. However great the difference between spirit and nature, between aesthetic joy and that flutter in the diaphragm, between reality and picture, yet the transposition can be in its own way adequate. I said before that in your drawing you had only plain white paper for sun and cloud, snow, water, and human flesh. In one sense, how miserably inadequate, yet in another, how perfect. If the shadows are properly done, that patch of white paper will, in some curious way, be very like blazing sunshine. We shall almost feel cold while we look at the paper snow, and almost warm our hands at the paper fire. And may we not, by a reasonable analogy, suppose likewise that there is no experience of the spirit so transcendent and supernatural, no vision of deity himself so close and so far beyond all images and emotions, that to it there cannot be an appropriate correspondence on the sensory level? Not by a new sense, but by the incredible flooding of those very sensations we now have with a meaning, a transvaluation, of which we have here no faintest guess.
Oops. Yeah, I like rescue videos. Oops. Got some buttons I have to fix. Anyway, yeah. Will there be trucks? This is but the shadow of the truck. So, yeah, real joy. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think.